We'll have the barrel engines.
All right, you ready?
Yeah.
Okay, can you tell me your name?
The brownish orange bar represents not safe. In Carluck, everybody we asked this question of said, no, they're not safe to eat, we won't eat them. Pretty close to everybody in Uzinki, pretty close to everybody in Port Lions felt they were unsafe. The lime bar represents safe. So in Chignik Lake, 80% felt that it was safe. Akio, 80%. So gathering from perception, again, it seems like recovery in the affected communities is occurring, but it's not uniform. Other selfish, Badarkis, are they safe for your family to eat? When I was in Port Graham and Nanwalek, some people I met who were gracious enough to offer me food offered me shellfish, which I happily ate. But I'm glad I didn't have to answer the survey. Anyway, judging from it, most people felt in most of the study communities that either they were safe to eat them or they weren't sure. And it seems like folks are being circumspect. That is to say, the jury's out. They're not yet sure if it's safe. Although many of them say, oh yeah, go ahead. It's been plenty of time, what the heck. What about seals? Many of our study communities said, yes, the seals are safe to eat. And by the way, at a conference on environmental health and management, I think this conclusion is really important because there's no doubt in our mind, at least in my mind, from the position I have looking over statewide subsistence harvest and use data, that subsistence or wild foods are so much more healthy for people than what folks can buy from whatever shops or stores are available. And that even if there were measurable levels of contamination, depending on what those levels were, of course, those wild foods would still be a better choice for most people than the salt and sugar and fat-laden products that the majority of Americans are relying upon more and more and more. Are herring safe? Most people aren't sure. They're not sure if the herring are safe. They're waiting to see. Some people figured, oh, they're okay, but no one was outright saying that they're not safe. They're just not sure. As to say, I think rural people in Alaska are pretty smart, and they don't just buy the first thing that comes along in terms of information. So the percent of people that said seals are safe to eat between 91 and 2003. It's held relatively steady, although as you can see from the 2003 lavender purplish bar, that a lot more people are thinking that they're safe, as my earlier graph suggested. This is problematic, however, because as many of you know, younger people seem to be losing their taste for subsistence foods, seal meat and a variety of others. So it may be a challenge to convince younger people from rural Alaska to really reinvest in acquiring a taste for subsistence foods. And part of the argument, if reason has much to do with taste, is that, well, they're better for you than store-bought food. Percent saying, yeah, clams are safe to eat by year has dropped somewhat in most communities, although there's still a few exceptions. Akyo, Chignik Bay, Chignik Lagoon, saying, yeah, it's better now than it was before. Here's a really interesting question. Have you observed, this is one of the questions that our staff asked in the field, have you observed changes in the environment or the habitat of subsistence resources that you rely on? And the percent that say yes in 98 here is in red, and in 2003 is in purple. So it's held pretty steady, with a few, again, exceptions. But in social science, we expect exceptions. We don't expect 100% conformity. Number of people saying no, subsistence resources have not recovered since the spill. 98 is in red, 2003 is in purple. So interestingly, contrary to some of our actual data that people themselves have reported, they're also saying that no, resources have not recovered. Yeah?
On your previous slide, did you get any idea of what the indicators were of the changes in the habitat? Or is this just kind of a yes, no?
Yeah, we asked people to elaborate, but we didn't factor those elaborations into the construction of these graphs. That's something that we hope to go back to in more detail. As I said at the top of the presentation, these are preliminary findings. I'm sharing them with you because I thought it would be important to get this information out at a conference such as this one, rather than wait for the sort of ponderous operation of state bureaucracy to produce our actual report, which may take up to a year. But ultimately, when our final report is produced, it will include some of those specific observations. But we have to be careful when using people's words because we do have a strict confidentiality requirement in our data collection. So we need to make sure that when we use direct quotations, it's not, at least not immediately obvious who was speaking unless we were given permission by that person to use their name. And that's just standard practice in social science. But I'm sure many of you in this room have specific observations that might well pertain to that last graph. And I'd be happy to hear them, actually. So, do you need to purchase subsistence foods that you couldn't obtain through harvesting or sharing? The percent answering yes has, in most cases, increased across the board. So what they didn't catch or kill in traditional expectations, folks have had to begin buying, which causes a potential stress on local economies that are already, shall we say, precarious. If more money has to go to food, then that means less money is available for, say, gasoline or, I don't know, shells for your shotgun, components of a subsistence hunt. How many people said yes, they need to buy store foods to replace subsistence foods? Red for 98, purple for 2003. You can see that on the whole, folks are saying, yeah, they need to buy replacement foods. How has sharing changed in the past 5 years? Because as we know, sharing is a critical component of any subsistence economy. Purple in this case represents more sharing, red represents less sharing, and lime represents the same amount. So you can see pretty consistently that people in the surveyed communities, at least, are cleaving or holding to the importance of sharing, which speaks to the cultural vibrancy of subsistence practices. Another question we were curious about is how have elders' influence, how has elders' influence changed over time, if at all? Purple represents an increase in influence, according to our research respondents. Lime represents the same influence, and red represents decreased influence. compared to 5 years ago. As you can see, the general trend is toward feeling that elders' influence is decreasing. This is a worrisome trend for us in Subsistence Division because it suggests that culture bearing, if you will, is becoming, at least potentially becoming, less important to younger Alaskans, younger rural Alaskans. We were curious to know if folks thought that younger adults were learning sufficient subsistence skills to carry on when their elders are no longer available to advise them. How many folks said yeah? Yellow in 91, red in 98, purple in 03. So the percentage ranges, it seemed like a lot of people figured, yeah, they're learning enough. So again, you're seeing contradictory responses, and that's really to be expected when you're dealing with people's perceptions. And as far as my job is concerned, we provide the data to the boards of fish and board of game, and obviously to you, the public, and let you make the decisions about how to regulate access to our wild resources or not. How many said yes to the question, the traditional way of life, was it affected by EVOs? Red in 98, purple in 2003. Just about everyone said, yeah, the traditional way of life has been affected by the oil spill. And there were a variety of follow-ups to that answer, yes. Yes, it's been affected because there's less of resource X, or yes, it's been affected because people are leaving, or yes, it's been affected because. Has it recovered since the oil spill? Most folks, purple in 2003 again, red in 98, most folks have said no. Overall, no, it has not. We also asked if people felt that they were adequately informed about the GEM program. If none of you know that acronym, it stands for the Gulf Ecosystem Monitoring Program that's run by the Exxon Valdez Oil Spill Trustee Council. It's a consortium of tribal councils and community representatives who are working together to keep track in very fine detail of changes within the affected regions of the Gulf of Alaska. So, do you feel you're adequately informed about it? Orange represents a no answer, and yellow represents a don't know answer. So, it looks like the Exxon Valdez Oil Spill Trustee Council has its work cut out for it regarding the perceptions of the Gulf Ecosystem Monitoring Project. Do you feel your tribal council is adequately involved in the program? Lime is yes. So Chenega Bay and Satitlik folks felt like, yeah, their tribal council is pretty much on top of it. But just about all the other communities felt like either if their councils were not sufficiently involved, or they just didn't know. So maybe they themselves weren't sufficiently informed. And that's the end of my slides for you. But I would like to say one other thing, and that is that in my position as the chief scientist, if you will, for the Division of Subsistence, I often get calls from around the country of either two kinds. One call is from someone who says, hey, I saw a TV show the other day that said you can still live off the land in Alaska. Is that true? And how do I do that? And I usually answer that question by saying, well, you should probably read a few books first. And if you've never been to Alaska, then you might want to reconsider unless you feel like you can lay claim to about 10,000 years of practice, because that's what the cultures up here can rely upon. The other kind of question I get is, why are you bothering to keep track of subsistence economies in rural Alaska? I mean, after all, Dr. Dizard, isn't this way of life something that's, destined to pass away in evolutionary terms? I mean, this is a modern era, and shouldn't these people sort of get modern like the rest of us? That's a more difficult question for me to deal with, because there's a lot of built-in assumptions in that question that simply don't exist in the former question. The former question is based on ignorance, but this question is based on a certain kind of information. However, from my perspective, again, as the statewide program manager for Subsistence, with access to the kind of data that I have access to, it seems to me that that question is absolutely backwards. In other words, it seems to me that the proper question would be, Dr. Dizard, do you think that capitalist consumer-based economies can really last very much longer because of the difficulties of distribution, difficulties of production, difficulties of market exchange? Whereas it seems to me that if we take the past 10, 12, 15, 20,000 years of archaeological data, subsistence economies are the ones that are going to last. They have a proven track record, in fact. And so it seems to me, again, that what we really ought to be thinking of is how to learn the lessons that subsistence users understand intuitively, which is to say, protecting resources, taking only what you need and no more, and valuing community above all else. So thanks a lot. I'm happy to take any questions you have for the remainder of our time. Yeah?
Yeah, when you were talking about the pounds of fish per person, how did you collect that? Did you ask how much fish 5 people caught or 50 people? Or?
Actually, we have a pretty complicated way of figuring that out, but usually what we'll do is ask about how many fish did you catch last year? And then we have formulas for figuring out how much fish in round weight equals fish in dressed weight equals pounds per capita. These are formulas that we share with the the Department of Health and Human Services when they do their nutrition studies. These are standard formula accepted internationally for calculating how much per pound, per capita, how many calories, how many kilocalories. So these are pretty standard measures, even though obviously the size of fish varies. But our formula are designed to essentially statistically even out those differences. However, this is a potential problem in our research. When you ask people, how many fish did you catch last year? It's kind of like asking folks, so where exactly were you on Tuesday, the 14th of November in '03? Do you know? Sometimes you kind of have to guess, or you need reminders. So ideally, we'd like to be able to meet people at the dock, representative samples, and measure their catch. That might lend some more accuracy to our estimates. But as I mentioned earlier, the Subsistence Division is sort of the redheaded stepchild. If I didn't mention it, I should now. We're sort of the redheaded stepchild in Fish and Game, and my director has to regularly beat people up in order to get more funding for our research as it is. And so if you are really anxious about having accurate fisheries measurements and feel like our data might be in need of some revision, by all means contact your state legislature and urge them to fund Subsistence Division research, because I share your anxiety. Yeah?
Do you look into why you see some discrepancies in your graphs? I'm thinking about the clown. One area says, one town will say 100% they're unsafe. And then you have another town that will say 100% they're safe. Do you look at any of those kind of something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. And as I tried to suggest, there are all kinds of reasons why that'll vary. Sometimes it has to do with who my staff were able to contact. So for example, if they were able to contact people, individuals who frankly don't really care, then that's going to affect the data that we crank out on the other end. How well informed are people? As you could see, that a lot of people didn't really know about the Gulf Ecosystem Monitoring Project, so it might be reasonable to conclude, although I'm not going to officially conclude this right now, but it might be reasonable to conclude that they're equally uninformed about the effects of persistent organic pollutants in filter feeders like shellfish.
There are some communities too that they have a plant very close to them. They test them every month for a great time.
Yeah, so it'll also vary by region. Anybody here from Port Graham? Yeah, so have you guys noted an increase in sea otters around Port Graham?
Yes, there's, seem to be little lesser in the bay. Last year, we went over and looked at it, it seemed to be getting a little more.
Oh, they're going down now? Okay, interesting. What I'm getting at by asking that question is that there are also regional variations in population. And so because some predators were wiped out or significantly reduced by the oil spill, certain other species have been able to grow more than they would, so their availability is higher, so people use them more, regardless of the potential dangers of contamination.
Yeah, there's different stocks of animals, fish will go up and down, cycling.
Right, and another one of the key features of subsistence economies, in addition to sharing, is that folks can switch from one resource to another with relative ease. As to say, they're not, I mean, if people here in Anchorage suddenly realize that Fred Meyer and Safeway and cars and everything else were closed for the next month, that would be a big problem. But the equivalent in subsistence economy is a small problem. They can often find other replacement foods. Well, I wouldn't say a small problem, but smaller. Yeah.
That slide about how much do you know about the EVOS GEM program, there seems to be a big disconnect. Any speculation as to why? Is it a very well-funded program?
Yeah, exactly. It is a very well-funded program. And it was surprising to me when I saw that graphic representation, because I would have expected that people felt, no, they were well informed. And frankly, at this point, I don't really have a good explanation as to why. This is something that's going to definitely bear scrutiny in the future. We want to see if we can figure that out, and I'm sure that the EVOS Trustee Council is anxious about that outcome too. Because obviously they're in a position of wanting people to get, as they mentioned in their goal, their objectives, to get back to pre-spill levels. And part of that is going to be good science measuring how safe the resources are. If I were to hazard a guess, I'd say because it might have something to do with staff turnovers in tribal council, and perhaps unintended dropping through the cracks kind of thing. That's not uncommon in state bureaucracies, and so I don't see why it should be any different for other forms of bureaucracy. It's not something we in state bureaucracies are proud of, but it is a feature of bureaucracies that some information just disappears and you find out about it later and try and do what you can to correct that. Yeah?
Do you share these results with each of the villages and just ask for their kind of feedback after you have your drafts?
Yeah, we do, absolutely. And this presentation that I shared with you is the outcome of a workshop that, instead of sending all our people back out to all the villages, we invited key participants from the villages to a workshop we held here in Anchorage and shared all this information with them. But that happened too recently for me to be able to digest and interpret and then share some of the outcomes of that conversation with this audience. It's something that I want to be able to do in our final project report, however, but I can't give you a specific due date for that just yet. But if you're curious about these questions, I would urge each and every one of you to visit our Subsistence Division website, which is you just on the State of Alaska webpage. You can click down to subsistence to Fish and Game, and then from Fish and Game to Subsistence Division. And what you'll find on our website, in addition to some announcements, a variety of standard kinds of info things, is access to our community profile database. And that is the repository for over 20 years of subsistence information that my staff has been collecting. And it's free, it's open to the public. You can ask a wide variety of questions of this database, and it will churn out answers for you on the basis of averages or specific communities or representative samples, however you want to do it, broken down by resource and by village. So I would encourage you to make use of this public resource and tell your state legislator how groovy you think it really is.
One last question.
How did you guys go about getting responses? I was looking at your household.
Beating and choking. No.
Yeah, your household response is pretty high.
Yeah, that's because my staff are really good at what they do, which is to say they've been at it for a long time. We base our research on a social science model with a particular emphasis on cultural anthropology, which is why the division hired me. I'm a cultural anthropologist. And cultural anthropologists are pretty much famous for going there so you don't have to, kind of thing. And my staff are dedicated to what they do, and they have spent a lot of time in each of these survey communities long before this survey, collecting data for our community profile database, our CPDB, and for special projects. We are an equal opportunity think tank. We do research for anybody who can pay for our time, almost anybody. We do have some standards, but no, I'm joking, of course, we have many standards. But the reality is that our field staff are really dedicated, and they are well known in their communities. They don't just fly in and fly out. They actually stay there, stay for a while. In many cases, learn the language of the local region, and participate as fully as possible in the daily routines of the villages so that people come to trust us. I think another reason why our response rate is high is that we have no enforcement responsibilities. We're not going to bust anybody for telling us that they caught more fish than the legal limit. In fact, we don't really care. In our opinion, a dead resource is a dead resource. We just want to know how people are using it, and we don't really share our information with enforcement. I mean, we don't share our information with enforcement at the granular detail level so they can figure out who's doing what. And that harkens back to an earlier question about privacy of information. We maintain strict confidentiality so that folks trust us for the most part. And I don't know, I guess our director, she's a Yupik, and she has gone to great lengths to try and ensure that Subsistence Division staff are, well, they're not your average bear.
With that, we're gonna close up because we need to head off. We're gonna start the environmental awards luncheon at 11:30. And first, we'd all thank Jesse for coming and bringing the Juno weather with him. But thanks for coming all the way up here. If you want to.
I made sure not to work. Sorry, even for today and tomorrow.
Have you seen
They're pricing it.
Yes.
First
format
pricing it.
we had some scientists, two different types of scientists. One talked
Okay, talk to me.
I'm gonna stand up so I can get so I can recognize the camera.